All right. Hey guys, let's do another reaction. This time it's on the history of the United States in 10 minutes. Uh, besides late 800s England, I would say another field especially that I do have is the United States, as I am pretty big into studying this stuff because I do feel that studying your own history of the country that you live in is very important, as it is also extremely important in understanding the contextual situations that have led your country to where it is. Yeah, I encourage you highly, if you are from a different country, if you even live in the United States, to really study the history of your own country, because that can really help you understand the situation that your country is in modern day. Let's watch.
Even if the United States of America emerged as an independent country after 1776 and recognized in 1783, the history of these lands is deeper than that. Thousands of years ago, the first people settled in the American continent.
Oh, we're really doing history of the U.S. Damn.
It is not exactly known how the Native Americans first settled in these territories.
Yep.
But a theory says that people migrated from Eurasia starting 30,000 years ago, across a land bridge known as Beringia. This connected Siberia to North America during the Ice Age. This migration continued until 10,000 years ago. At that time, a glacial period ended, and the land bridge became submerged by the rising ocean. But before we move any further, we want to give a big thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video in Americas, and they formed called the Paleo Americans. In time, they migrated even deeper in Americas, and they formed tribes and nations. They created interesting civilizations, developing their own culture. Among the cultures that existed here, we can mention Adena culture, Iroquois culture, Coles Creek culture, Puebloan culture, and Mississippian culture.
I haven't heard Adena culture before.
The United States has an interesting and different history. Speaking about Hawaii, this land wasn't inhabited until the 1st centuries AD. Native development started with the settlement of Polynesian people between the 1st and 10th centuries. Starting in the 15th century, European colonization began. In 1492, a Spanish expedition headed by the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus sailed west to find a new trade route to the Far East, but landed in what came to be known to Europeans as the New World. After this event, in the next decades, more and more ships sailed west to establish
a big time jump from the first peoples coming to Christopher Columbus.
Colonies and trade posts. The Spaniards began building their American empire, using islands such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola as bases. They expanded hugely. France founded colonies in eastern North America, a number of Caribbean islands, and small coastal parts of South America. Portugal colonized Brazil. The eastern seacoast was settled primarily by English colonists in the 17th century, along with a much smaller number of Dutch and Swedes. The first successful English...
I like that addition of the Dutch and Swedes. Just a little tidbit. They didn't really have too long of a lasting colonization on the eastern coast of the USA. But hey, they were there for a time.
Colony, Jamestown, was established in 1607 on the James River in Virginia. New wave of settlers arrived in the late 17th century and established commercial agriculture based on tobacco. Even though there were some conflicts between the Native Americans and English settlers, the colonies managed to expand pretty fast.
Yeah, I don't know if he's going to mention it later in a couple seconds, but Jamestown had conflict with the native settlers, but it's different in all parts. So up north in the Philadelphia region, they were more trade friendly with the natives, not necessarily super friendly, but they traded. They kind of lived alongside each other for the most part. Or well, lived alongside each other better than the settlers in Jamestown.
And more people settled in. Each of the 13 American colonies had slightly different governmental structure.
Yeah.
In fact, a colony was ruled by a governor appointed from London. This governor controlled the administration and relied upon a locally elected legislature to vote taxes and make laws. By the 18th century, the American colonies were growing very rapidly, and as a result of low death rates, along with ample supplies of land and food, This attracted a heavy flow of immigrants. The tobacco and rice plantations imported African slaves for labor from the British colonies in the West Indies.
Yeah, not to mention they also started off with indentured servitude in the Americas before switching over to importing and buying slaves from West Africa. I don't remember as to why really indentured servitude fell out of favor. I think part of it was because with indentured servitude you had to give, you kind of were expected to give something to them once they paid off their debt, I guess. They were expected to receive land after your indentured servitude time was up, but again, there were always issues with that, and it never really worked out that smoothly. While if you just bought some slaves from Africa, you didn't have to give them shit. You could treat them pretty much however you wanted. But obviously, the smart business owner would not kill their slaves, keep them alive because that was cheap. But still, ultimately, as the northern colonies would find out, it was cheaper to just pay them a wage instead of having them as slaves. But for some reason, the South never learned that, and they decided to be dumb racists.
And by the 1770s, African slaves comprised a fifth of the American population.
Yeah, African slaves were a huge proportion of the southern population. I can't remember exactly how much. I think it was closing in on 50% at one time, if I'm remembering right. Please do, if I'm wrong, please do correct me below.
The question of independence from Britain did not arise as long as the colonies needed British military support against the French and Spanish powers. The French and Indian War was an event created by the political development of the colonies. It was also part of the larger 7 Years' War. Britain beat French forces, and France lost their colonies and territories in Canada and Louisiana. The war was costly, and Britain needed money. The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, imposing a tax on the colonies without going through the colonial legislatures. The issue was drawn. Did Parliament have this right to tax Americans who were not represented in it? Crying, "No taxation without representation." The colonists refused to pay the taxes, as tensions escalated in the late 1760s and early 1770s. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was marked as the start of the Revolution. It happened in the town of Boston to protest against the new tax on tea. Parliament quickly responded the next year with the Coercive Acts, stripping Massachusetts of its historic right of self-government and putting it under army rule, which sparked outrage and resistance in all 13 colonies.
Remember, much of our Constitution, the amendments in the United States Constitution, are pretty much made in response to the actions that the British took on the American colonies. At least the first 10. Quartering of troops. That's in there because the British forced Americans to house British troops. The British tried to take away guns, so that's why there's the Second Amendment. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Britain tried to suppress some of that. Not as heavily as they would in... all these actions, though, that picked off and sparked the Independence War are also, though, are a lot lesser than what the Asian colonies of Britain had to deal with and the African colonies that Britain had to deal with. Yeah.
Leaders from all 13 colonies gathered.
Just remember that Britain wasn't too harsh on the American colonists because the American colonists were still white. Like, they did not treat the 13 colonies too well, but they still treated them better based on their descendancy from Britain compared to the African and Indian colonies.
And created the First Continental Congress to coordinate their resistance. The Congress called for a boycott of British trade, published a list of rights and grievances and petitioned the king for redress of those grievances. It wasn't about independence at that point, but this appeal had no effect.
Yes, I like how he's pointing that out, that it wasn't initially about independence. It was just about, hey, we don't want to get rid of you. We like being with the British because it gives us lots of money. But we don't want to be taxed without certain things. We fought in this war. We should be awarded stuff for it instead of just, being expected to tax more. We're going to get taxed more. Let's at least get some of the land that was won in the war. But the British did not want to give the 13 colonies more.
And so the Second Continental Congress was created in 1775 in order to organize the defense of the colonies against the British Army. The 13 colonies began a rebellion against British rule in 1775 and proclaimed their independence in 1776 as the United States of America. In the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, the Americans captured the British invasion army at Saratoga in 1777, secured the Northeast, and encouraged the French to make a military alliance with the United States. France brought in Spain and the Netherlands, thus balancing.
Oh my god, this is like probably one of the best videos ever. He mentioned that Spain and the Netherlands helped out the American Revolution, and it was not just the French. Yes, man, yes! Yes!
Balancing the military and naval forces on each side, as Britain had no allies. General George Washington was an excellent organizer and administrator who worked successfully with Congress and the state governors, selecting and mentoring his senior officers, supporting and training his troops, and maintaining an idealistic Republican army. The American Revolution was a success.
A little brief on the United States Revolution. I feel like it's also important to mention just how little support the Revolution actually had. It was a very small minority of the actual population. I don't know the statistics, but it was very few. It was definitely less than half. They were, obviously the vast majority of people probably cared which way the war went, but I think the loyalists to the British still had the majority. Especially in the South. The South wanted to stay loyal to the British. It was mainly the North that cared about independence. The North had the higher proportion of patriots, as we call them, or rebels, or, in some aspects, based upon certain actions, they were, in our modern definition, terrorists. But in the South was heavily loyalist to the British Empire, which I just think that's pretty interesting. How times have changed. How now in the South you have this, in the modern day in the South you have this preconceived notion that in the South the Americans down there are going to be extremely loyal to the American government, extremely patriotic in a sense, very much all about gung-ho about the American way of life. But back then, in the time period of the Revolution, the South wanted to stay with the British. I find stuff like that kind of interesting. The change in over time, like that, the way things develop and change over time is really, really cool, especially when looking at the United States, because obviously I live in the United States, so just cool to study that.
And at the Peace of Paris of 1783, their independence was recognized. And even so, the former colonies gained more than expected. The expansion to the west started.
I think also technically, though, the United States, I don't think it was necessarily more than expected. I think they did want to win on this land. I think they wanted to win more than that. I think, honestly, they wanted to get up to here. I think they wanted to take all of this. If not more. I think they really kind of wanted to take the British out, but for the most part during this time period, the Canadians didn't want to rebel. Canadians were still loyal. I think there was probably some appeal to the Quebecois, the French that still lived, French colonists that still lived in Quebec under British rule. I think there was some appeal to them, but it didn't work. And obviously the United States would try in 1812 to kick the British fully out of America and take Canada, and we all know how that went.
Incorporating the Amerindian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, a deal was made by the United States President Thomas Jefferson in 1803. He bought the Louisiana Territory from France. Initial diplomats sent to France were allowed to spend up to $10 million in order to buy just New Orleans, and, if possible, the west bank of the Mississippi River. But the French government said that for $5 million more, all of the Louisiana Territory would be sold.
That's just amazing how cheap he got that land, and now that land is essentially, obviously it's not including Illinois. Illinois is also part of the breadbasket of America, but all this land is like part of the breadbasket of the USA. Like so much food, so much corn, wheat.
The president approved the deal, and the U.S. doubled its size. In the middle of the 19th century, some cessions were happening, and Texas in joining the Union in 1845, and after the war against Mexican Empire, the United States will take important lands and expand even further. In 1861, after Abraham Lincoln was elected, some states from the South, the Confederation, attacked the rest. The South Revolt was happening due to controversy over the enslavement of black people.
Thank you for saying that it was about slavery, because it fucking was. The southern states seceded because they wanted to keep the right to own slaves. You should not have the right to own another human. It's just so hate Confederacy so much. And that's how West Virginia came to be, because they wanted to stay in the Union, while the other part of Virginia wanted to be in the Confederacy. Split off.
1860, the United States was led by Abraham Lincoln, supporting banning slavery in all territories.
Not initially. It's complicated, but obviously this is history of the United States in 10 minutes, so you probably can't go into it. So I'm just gonna add it on. Abe Lincoln probably wasn't too interested in equality. It's really hard to really know for sure, because it's really complex, and we don't, obviously, the 1800s were a time period where information was not entirely available, of course. But yeah, I think he did care more about preserving the Union. At first, the Emancipation Proclamation was to free the slaves in the Confederacy, and then eventually the 13th Amendment would be passed, in which it got rid of the rest of the slaves in the entire Union. And of course, though, the 13th Amendment has the little stipulation that if you are a prisoner, / you are in jail, you're a convicted criminal, you can technically be used for slave labor. Slavery is technically still not illegal in the USA.
War broke out in April 1861, when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. After 4 years of war, the Union achieved its victory. And
the bloodiest war in U.S. history. 600,000 Americans would lose their lives in this war. That's a total. If that were taken into the proportions of today, that would be 6 million Americans dead today. There's just a little thing to think.
And the Confederates were defeated. National unity was slowly restored. The national government expanded its power. The 19th century...
Yes, thank you for adding that too. That's great. Oh, this is a great video. He also added in, during this war, the federal government expanded their powers immensely. Immensely.
It was a period of economic expansion. More and more industries were created, and also the ascent was put on infrastructure. In 1898, the American-Spanish War is happening.
Spain loses Cuba, USA gained Puerto Rico and Guam, the Philippine Islands for $2. Oh, I didn't know they paid for the Philippine Islands, huh? That's true. That is interesting. Huh. I just thought that was,
are winning in short term some battles, and at the Treaty of Paris, U.S. is getting the Philippines,
Another
Puerto
Treaty of
Rico,
Paris.
and Guam. At the beginning of the 20th century, World War I started. Even though the U.S. was neutral due to German attacks on the American ships and due to their intentions to make Mexico join against the U.S., the Americans joined the Allies. After this event, the economy was growing and all was good.
The United States was also very hesitant to join the First World War because of the sheer amount of German immigrants that lived in the United States. Like, I think the vast majority of white Americans can claim descent from Germans.
Until the Great Depression, which started in 1929. This event shook the world and created a base on which the Second World War will start. United States joined the Allies after being attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 by the Japanese Empire. Americans fought a distant war in Europe, Pacific, and they provided supplies to the Soviets, armored cars, motorized equipment, food, etc. Winning battle by battle in the Pacific, getting closer to the Japanese mainland, and after D-Day in Europe in 1944, the Americans managed to have a great impact and to help a lot on the Allied side. The war ended in
And it should also be mentioned that the United States sent a lot of machinery and guns to the Soviets. I think one of the popular sayings for World War II is the war was won by British courage, something like that. Soviet blood and the United States steel. Obviously, that overlooks the impact that Indian troops had because they made up the vast majority of British military. Canadian aid that came in Canada was also very helpful, as they did take some beaches in Normandy, and they did a bunch of other things. New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, all of the people, every nation that was involved in the war sacrificed.
1945, Germany capitulated in May, and Japan in September after the 2 nuclear bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers in the aftermath of World War II. This was a period known as the Cold War. The two countries confronted each other indirectly in the arms race, proxy wars across the world, including the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and propaganda campaigns. The purpose of this was to stop the spread of communism. In the 1960s, waves of civil rights movements started, rights of voting and freedom of movement to African Americans and other racial minorities. The Cold War ended with the collapse of...
Yes, I think that's important to add too. Even though at the end of the Civil War, Black Americans were technically given the right to vote. Or, well, I should add, male Black Americans were given the right to vote. Women would not be given the right to vote until 1920, around there. I think it was around 1920. Women were given the right to vote. But blacks would still not be allowed to vote, really, because of Jim Crow laws until the 60s.
Of the Soviet Union. After, the United States has been focusing on modern conflicts in the Middle East. The beginning of the 21st century saw the September 11th attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda in 2001, which was later followed by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2008, the United States had its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. A big thank you again to our...
This is a great video. Oh, this is great. A lot more in depth, certain parts, than I actually expected it to be. And subtle nods to certain things that's, like, he was very general in his, obviously in the history of the United States. He had to cover so much. But despite the generalization of things, it didn't lead to misinformation. It didn't lead to, like, misunderstanding of anything. What he left out are just things that can expand upon what he has talked about and can expand and help understand greater history of the United States. And don't. I'm just amazed at how good some people can be explaining history so briefly without like leading to misinformation, because that's the biggest issue with generalizing things or teaching things in short, in brief 10-minute videos, is it can lead to misinformation. That's one of the problems. So, and he did a great job of not falling into that trap. I have no further comment. This was a great video. This is amazing. I'll leave a link to the video down below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button and subscribe for more if you want to see more videos. Also, don't forget to comment down below what history videos you would like to see me react to next. Thank you.